Hello, hello. Actually, I like the way Alex opened his talk. Who here has a Solana wallet? Who's ever actually interacted on-chain on Solana? Please raise your hand. All right, I assume that's all the meme coin traders in the back. Awesome. Well, hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll be slightly more interested in engaging with Solana on-chain, and in particular in engaging with the pretty amazing DeepIn ecosystem that's on Solana. And if you're a DeepIn builder, hopefully this motivates you to actually build your DeepIn projects on Solana. This is, I think, one of the most important areas in crypto. So, all right. I think this is maybe a little bit redundant for this audience, but I'll go through it anyways. I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about why, we at the Solana Foundation think that DeepIn is such an important thing. And for me, it's basically that distributed infrastructure just runs our world, right? So if you look at the way the internet works, the way the electricity grid works, the way we get data about our world, temperature, air quality, that kind of stuff, data storage, computer, all of these things at their core are distributed infrastructure networks. But these infrastructure networks are really, really hard to build for a bunch of reasons. One, they're super expensive. Two, they're very complicated to build, especially when the infrastructure needs to be across the world. And finally, you always end up in a situation where these services become super centralized and they end up being pretty unfair, right? If you look at a bunch of the infrastructure on the left side there, almost all of these things end up in a world where there's either a monopoly or an oligopoly. And I think that's pretty bad for sort of society as a whole. All right, and so I think this is the magic of DeepIn, is that it actually pretty uniquely solves a lot of the things that make distributed infrastructure networks difficult. Tokens are magic money, and you can use that magic money to get people to do really interesting, powerful things, like run a Helium router or install a demo device in their car. By getting individual contributors in places across the world to to operate hardware, you can actually scale hardware networks much faster than the sort of traditional approach. It turns out that a person in a random town in Brazil, he knows the best place to put a Helium hotspot because he knows the town, he knows the guy who owns the house that has the best position in town to put a hotspot. And so for a bunch of reasons, I actually think that DeepIn approaches are much faster at scaling hardware networks than traditional ones. And then finally, I think in the long term, the thing that's really important for DeepIn and why it's good for society is that I think it ends up being a much fairer way for us to have these large infrastructure networks where the people who contribute the most, who have the most tokens, can have the most say in the way the network evolves over time. And so that's a little bit about why we think DeepIn is really important. And now I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with DeepIn on Solana in particular. And it turns out there is a lot going on, right? So I think at this point, a lot of people are starting to recognize Solana as the home for DeepIn, and I think with very good reason. On the left side, you'll see there a lot of the most OG projects in DeepIn, and some of the ones with the most notable market caps are on Solana, right? So Helium, Abhay was speaking earlier today. We've got Render, which has become quite a valuable project as sort of DeepIn and AI narratives have both taken off. And then you've got folks like HiveMapper that are doing sort of building the next generation Google Maps. So these are multi-billion-dollar projects, all built on Solana. And on the right side, you'll see there a ton of the up-and-coming sort of DeepIn projects on Solana. Some of those logos you might recognize: IONET, Grass, MetaBlocks, now called Roam. There's a huge wave of DeepIn projects coming on Solana as people have realized just how awesome of a network it is. And what I want to use the rest of the time for is actually talking about why are these builders choosing to build on Solana. And I think it really comes down to the four core things. One, Solana is just by far the most scalable network that's live today, and that's really, really relevant for DeepIn builders. Two, it is just a ridiculously fast network, and it's quite cheap. And I think it's quite cheap both for the people who are using the network or are sort of node contributors, and it's very cheap for the people who are building the applications or building the protocols. And then finally, the interoperability of Solana is actually one of the unique things about having everything in one shared state with no L2s, with no sharding. And deepen projects are actually pretty uniquely using that interoperability, and we'll get into some examples. So let's talk about scalability. First and foremost, Solana is doing more transactions than every other live network combined, and it's actually not even close, right? So you'll see the chart at the top there that Solana is just by far the most performant thing, and it's increasingly the one with the most users. Some of those users are Helium users. Some of those users are meme coin users. I won't say how many are which, but in general, what that's led to is just a ton of on-chain activity on Solana. Solana is really, really fast. So the table here is actually, it's not created by us. This is Circle, right? So Circle creates the USDC stablecoin. And Circle validates Solana-based transactions the fastest because it's the network that just has sub-second, I mean, it's even actually less than half a second finality. And that's a great user experience. When you click the button in your Phantom wallet, the transaction just happens, so it feels good. But for deepen networks sort of specifically, I've heard some pretty funny stories from deepen builders who've told me about trying to build deepen applications on Ethereum where it's a proof of location protocol, and by the time the user submits the transaction and the transaction actually gets finalized in Ethereum, the user is actually in a different location. And so like the thing just doesn't work. And so the person who actually gave me this quote then had to migrate to Solana because transaction finality is actually fast enough for the proof of location system to actually work. All right, so let's talk a little bit about cost. The point here is that Solana is really, really cheap, right? So Solana average transaction fees are well below 1 cent. But the thing that's particularly great about the network is that it stays cheap even when there's a ton of network activity, right? So the two charts at the top is actually, there's a day in December in which Solana was doing more DEX volume than Ethereum. This is actually pretty common these days, but this was a big deal at the time. And what you'll see on the right there is the fees on the network. In particular, sort of the red line is the median fee, so the fee that represents sort of the middle of what users paid. And you'll see that the median fee, even on record-breaking activity days, basically just doesn't move. And that's for a bunch of reasons in the way the network's designed, but in particular because the network has a high degree of parallelization. So just because there's a meme coin that's very hot that people want to trade doesn't mean that deepen networks should be affected by that network activity and should have to pay more in fees. And so the low-cost thing is also very relevant for developers. This is actually an example from Helium. So when Helium migrated to Solana almost exactly a year ago, they actually minted roughly close to 1 million NFTs in one day. And I think that cost them about $200. And so this is just one example of the way in which you can do things on Solana at just crazy scale that aren't possible in other networks. And so I think it's very possible for deepen networks to issue single NFTs to identify individual nodes in their network, and they can do this very cheaply. And then lastly, let's talk a little bit about interoperability. So the beautiful thing about Solana is that deepen applications on Solana get to build on top of everything else that's on the network, right? And there's a lot of stuff on the network. You've got things like Jupiter and the rest of the DeFi ecosystem that are now doing tens of billions of dollars of volume every month. You've got a lot of stablecoins. You've got marketplaces, both the centralized exchanges and NFT marketplaces. You basically have a lot of this infrastructure so that deepen projects don't have to rebuild it. They can just tap into sort of a bunch of best-in-class services already built on the chain. And there's also sort of within deepen interoperability, right? So there's a couple of cool examples of this. Hivemapper and Helium are both on Solana, and they work together. And specifically, what they do is they have Helium devices validating the location of Hivemapper drivers who are collecting mapping data so that the Helium devices can help make sure that, hey, the Hivemapper data actually wasn't cheating. They were actually in the location where they say they were taking the picture. And a second example of a bunch of cooperation and interoperability between Solana Deepen projects at the bottom there, which is Render, which actually has onboarded, I think, 6 or 7 compute clients, and 3 of those 6 are actually other Solana projects. And I think some of them are in the crowd here somewhere. So there's some really powerful network effects that are taking place as deepen projects on Solana get to work with each other. And lastly, I wanted to touch a little bit on Asia and why we think it's such an important thing. We think DeepIn in general is important, but Asia in particular is critical. And that's because there's a ton of talent here. So a number of DeepIn projects on Solana, their founders are based somewhere in Asia. Maybe even more importantly, Asia is actually where we're seeing the most growth for a lot of the DeepIn projects on Solana. I thought there were some pretty crazy statistics there. So Grass has had its APAC user base grow 1,000% in the last 90 days. And that's made sort of APAC users the majority of users on the network. Metablocks also has over 50% of its nodes in the network in Asia. This is the map here on the right is their node network. So Asia is, I think, critically important. And of course, almost all the hardware gets built here. So if you're at all serious about DeepIn, you have to be here. So I'm quite excited to be here. And then the last thing, just some more long-term things that we're thinking about with respect to DeepIn. One is DeepIn's power to really disrupt some of the existing monopolies and the oligopolies, the AWSs of the world, the GCPs. I think some people have touched on this earlier, but I really see being a node operator as being very similar to being a gig economy worker in the culture today. Right? Today, people drive for Uber or they deliver for Deliveroo. It's supplemental income for them, and it's a very culturally accepted thing. And I think we're going to see being part of a DeepIn network to be a similarly very culturally accepted way to earn income. This one, I haven't talked about the saga that much, but I'll just say that I think one thing that we're very much thinking about is how do you make mobile phones the ultimate DeepIn rewards device. And I know that the Saga team is actually working with a lot of DeepIn projects on Solana right now to help figure that out. So I won't say anything past that, but more to come. And then finally, I think there's a lot that actually the public and private sector can do to work together, because DeepIn might be the best way for us to scale a lot of the hardware that's really important for us as a sort of humanity, in particular with respect to GPU compute as AI becomes a huge thing, and as we all try to sort of build more green energy infrastructure. I think DeepIn has a huge part to play in both of those infrastructure trends. All right, so hopefully, more of you guys will be curious and interested in creating a Solana wallet, participating in some of the DeepIn projects on Solana, and ideally building your own applications on Solana as well. Thank you.